Okay, let's dive in. Welcome to the deep dive, where we take a complex topic and really try to break it down to the essentials you need fast. Today, we're tackling something that comes up a lot, the potential link between drinking sugary beverages and cancer risk. Our source material for this deep dive is, well, it's a pretty significant recent paper, a systematic review and dose response meta analysis published in the Journal of Cancer. So, this wasn't just one new study, but a really comprehensive look at lots of existing studies, 71 articles actually, covering both sugar sweetened beverages, SSBs, and interestingly, fruit juice too.
That's right. And a meta-analysis, just so everyone's clear, it's basically where researchers gather up results from, many smaller studies on the same question. They combine them statistically. It's like pooling all the data together to get a much bigger picture, hopefully more robust findings than any single study could give us. The studies they pulled together here were observational. So they either watched people's habits and health over time, those are cohort studies, or they compared people who have cancer with those who don't, case control studies. And the mission really for this specific meta-analysis was to evaluate that possible relationship between drinking sugary drinks and, well, both the risk of getting cancer in the first place and the risk of dying from it.
Right. And we know diet and health research is, well, it's notoriously tricky, isn't it? So many factors involved. So this kind of effort, synthesizing a big chunk of research, is really important, even if, it still leaves us with some questions at the end. Okay, let's jump into what they actually found. What was the sort of big picture takeaway when they pooled all this data on sugar-sweetened beverages and overall cancer?
Okay, so looking at the overall cancer picture risk and mortality across all the studies they included, compared to the people who drank the least amount of SSBs, those who drank the most, well, they showed a statistically significant increased risk. For overall cancer risk, the analysis suggested about a 12% higher risk. And for overall cancer mortality, they found something similar, suggesting about a 7% higher risk for the highest consumers.
Okay, 12% higher risk, 7% higher mortality risk. So when they put all these studies together, a pattern did seem to emerge. It suggests drinking more sugary drinks might be linked to a higher chance of getting cancer generally, and maybe a higher chance of dying from it. An increased risk, that number above 1, tells us the exposure more SSBs here seems linked with a greater chance of the outcome. Right.
Exactly. And the fact it was statistically significant suggests it's, unlikely to be just a random fluke across all that combined data. And what's interesting, too, is that this association for overall cancer risk with SSBs, it held up across both types of observational studies. It looked at the case control and the cohort studies.
Got it. Okay. Now, what about fruit juice? Because people often think of that differently, maybe healthier than soda. Did they find a similar link there?
This is where things get a little bit different, maybe less clear-cut. When they looked at fruit juice intake across all the study types combined, they didn't actually find a statistically significant link with overall cancer risk. However, and this is kind of important, when they specifically zeroed in on just the cohort studies, the ones following people over time, then fruit juice intake did show a positive association with overall cancer risk. In just those cohort studies, drinking the most fruit juice was linked to about a 6% higher risk compared to drinking the least.
Okay. So a suggested link for fruit juice and overall cancer risk, but really only popping up as statistically significant when they isolated those cohort studies. And what about fruit juice and dying from cancer, the mortality aspect?
Yeah, there just wasn't enough data on that specific question, fruit juice and cancer mortality, across the studies they could pool. So they couldn't really draw a conclusion there. So you see, the evidence for a link to overall cancer risk seemed a bit more consistent, statistically speaking, for SSBs across the different study types. Whereas for fruit juice, that signal was mainly coming through in the cohort studies subset.
Okay, so that's the overall view. A suggested link for SSBs with both getting cancer and dying from it, and a suggested link for fruit juice risk, but mainly in those cohort studies. Now let's drill down a bit, because this is often where the really interesting stuff is. Did the analysis find links between these drinks and specific types of cancer?
Yes, absolutely. And this is where they get really granular looking site by site. For SSB consumption, sugar-sweetened beverages, the analysis did find statistically significant positive associations, suggesting an increased risk for several specific cancers. Okay, so these included breast cancer. High consumption there was linked to about a 21% higher risk. Then there was hepatocellular carcinoma, was a type of liver cancer. That showed a really strong association, actually suggesting a doubling of risk, potentially, with high SSB intake. They also flagged up a link for colorectal cancer, suggesting about a 14% higher risk. and also prostatic cancer, again, suggesting about a 14% higher risk.
Wow. Okay. A relative risk of 2.00 for liver cancer risk. That's quite a jump, suggesting double the risk for high consumers in those particular studies.
It is a large relative risk figure, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's really important to remember, like you said, it was based on a smaller number of studies within the whole meta-analysis compared to, say, breast or colorectal cancer. And this is exactly where we need that caution, right? Strong signals from limited data are interesting. They generate hypotheses, but they're definitely not proof.
Right. Context is key. And you mentioned earlier there were some maybe surprising findings too, almost counterintuitive.
Yes, that's right. The meta-analysis actually reported finding statistically significantly lower risks linked with SSB consumption for two specific cancers. Glioma, which is a type of brain tumor high intake, was linked to about a 19% lower risk, and non-cardiac gastric cancer, suggesting about a 31% lower risk.
A lower risk. That does seem really surprising, kind of goes against the grain of the other findings. How did the authors explain something like that?
Well, this is a perfect illustration of why we have to be so careful with observational data alone. The authors themselves explicitly warn that these inverse findings, the lower risks, were each based on a tiny number of studies within their analysis, just 2 studies for each of those cancer types. So the evidence there is extremely limited. It could easily be unstable, It's definitely not grounds for saying sugary drinks protect against these cancers. Often, these kinds of unexpected findings in observational studies point more towards maybe uncontrolled confounding factors or some kind of bias in those specific studies rather than a true protective effect.
That makes a lot of sense. The strength of the evidence really matters. Okay, so let's recap the specific risks tied to SSBs. They suggested links for breast, liver, colorectal, and prostate cancer. They noted those surprising lower risks for glioma and gastric cancer, but based on very weak evidence. What about all the other specific cancer types they looked at, like esophageal, kidney, bladder, ovarian, pancreatic, etc.? Any link with SSB risk there?
For most of those others you just listed, yeah, esophageal, gastric overall, renal, bladder, ovary, endometrial, pancreatic, hematopoietic, nasopharyngeal, biliary tract. The meta-analysis suggested no statistically significant evidence of an association with SSB consumption risk. The signals just weren't strong enough or consistent enough across the pooled studies to meet their threshold for significance.
Okay. So it's definitely not a case of increased risk across the board for all cancers. The signal seems more concentrated for risk. Now, let's switch gears slightly to cancer mortality for specific types. Did they see a similar pattern there? Was the risk of dying from specific cancers linked to SSBs?
When they looked specifically at dying from particular cancers linked to SSB intake, the analysis only found breast cancer mortality showed that statistically significant association. It suggested about a 17% higher risk of dying from breast cancer for high SSB consumers compared to low consumers. But for colorectal cancer mortality, prostate cancer mortality, and lung cancer mortality, there was no significant association found with SSB consumption in this specific analysis.
Interesting. So the link seems stronger for breast cancer, both getting it and dying from it. But for others, like colorectal and prostate, it was the risk of getting it but not necessarily dying from it, according to this analysis.
Precisely. And that highlights something important. The risk of developing a disease and the risk of dying from it, they don't always track perfectly together in these kinds of studies.
Right. Now, beyond just comparing the highest versus lowest drinkers, the study also tried to look at dose response. Like, does drinking more sugary drinks seem to push the risk up further, step by step?
Yes. They did conduct a dose response analysis focusing on the prospective cohort studies, which are generally better suited for looking at this kind of thing. And it did suggest a sort of linear relationship for overall cancer risk. For sugar-sweetened beverages specifically, they calculated that for every extra 1 serving per day of SSB intake, there was a suggested 4% increase in overall cancer risk.
Okay, a 4% bump in overall cancer risk for each daily serving. How did fruit juice stack up in that dose response analysis for risk? Again, looking just at the cohort studies.
Well, for fruit juice, in those cohort studies they analyzed for dose response, the increase was actually steeper. They found a suggested 14% increase in overall cancer risk for every 1 serving per day increment in fruit juice intake.
Wow, okay. 14% increase per serving per day for fruit juice risk in those cohort studies compared to 4% for SSBs in that analysis. That's a pretty noticeable difference in the suggested dose response.
It is a striking finding, yes, specifically within those cohort studies they looked at for dose response. It's also worth pointing out, though, that when they tried to do a similar dose-response analysis for mortality, overall cancer mortality, and colorectal cancer mortality linked to SSB intake, They did not find a statistically significant relationship there. And as we mentioned before, there just wasn't enough data for them to do a dose-response analysis specifically for fruit juice mortality.
I see. So the dose-response link for risk seems clearer in this analysis, especially for overall cancer in cohort studies than it does for mortality. Now, the paper also touches on the potential how, right? The biological reasons why these links might exist. What are some of the mechanisms researchers think might connect sugary drinks to increased cancer risk?
Yeah, they mentioned several plausible biological routes. A major one is simply the high sugar load hitting your system quickly. It causes rapid blood sugar spikes, a high glycemic index effect. Over time, this can contribute to weight gain and obesity. And we know obesity itself is a really well-established risk factor for a whole bunch of cancers, including several they found links for, like liver, prostate, endometrial, colorectal, and breast cancer.
Okay, so obesity is one potential pathway.
Right. But it's probably not just about obesity. These drinks can directly mess with your insulin and glucose regulation. Drinking them regularly can lead towards insulin resistance, meaning your body doesn't respond to insulin as well. And you end up with higher circulating levels of insulin and also something called insulin-like growth factor I, or IGFI. And the problem is, these molecules, insulin and IGF, can actually act like fuel for tumor cells, potentially encouraging them to grow and survive.
So directly promoting tumor growth, potentially.
Potentially, yes. And beyond that, these imbalances in glucose and insulin can increase oxidative stress and inflammation throughout the body. Both oxidative stress, sort of like cellular rust and chronic inflammation, are heavily implicated in damaging DNA and creating an environment where cancer is more likely to develop and progress. The paper also briefly mentions other possibilities, like changes in fat tissue adiposity, affecting hormone levels, or maybe even specific chemical compounds. They mention 4-methylimidazole, which is in some caramel colorings, or maybe pesticide residues in fruit juice. But generally, the main suspected culprits are those metabolic and hormonal pathways related to the sugar intake itself and the body's response to it.
That helps paint a clearer picture, doesn't it? The potential chain reaction from drinking the sugary drink to possibly increasing cancer risk through these different biological avenues. So we've covered the findings, the specific links, the dose response, the potential how. This paper, being a meta-analysis, pulls together lots of studies. What did the authors themselves see as the main strengths of doing this kind of synthesis?
Well, a primary strength is just the sheer amount of data they could bring together. By combining 71 studies, they got a much larger sample size than any single study. And that increases what we call statistical power, basically, the ability to detect an association if it truly exists. Their comprehensive approach is also a plus, looking at both getting cancer incidence and dying from it, mortality, looking at overall cancer and specific types, and trying to do that dose-response analysis where they could. It gives a broad sweep of the existing evidence landscape.
Okay, sounds powerful.
However, and this is really crucial for anyone trying to make sense of these findings, the authors were also very upfront and detailed about the significant limitations, not just limitations of their own analysis, but limitations inherent in the very studies they were pooling those observational studies.
Okay, let's really unpack those limitations because, as you say, they're critical for understanding how much weight to put on these suggested links.
Absolutely. I mean, the most fundamental one is that this whole analysis relies entirely on observational studies. And while these studies are vital for seeing what happens in real human populations, they absolutely cannot prove cause and effect. It's just incredibly hard to perfectly account for all the other differences between people who drink lots of sugary drinks and those who don't.
Right, the confounding factors.
Exactly. Are they also eating more processed food generally?
Yeah.
Exercising less? Maybe more likely to smoke? Do they have different genetic risks? Researchers try their best to adjust for these statistically, but you can almost never eliminate their influence completely. In observational research, it's a huge challenge.
So that's confounding. What else?
Well, observational studies are also susceptible to various biases. Think about trying to remember exactly what you ate and drank over the last year, let alone decades. That's recall bias. It's imperfect. How the original studies recruited people could introduce bias. How they defined high versus low consumption wasn't always the same. The exact types of sugary drinks grouped together might have varied a bit. All these inconsistencies and potential biases from the original studies get mixed together in the meta-analysis, and that can definitely muddy the waters and affect the final results.
Okay, so methodological differences between the studies are an issue.
Yeah. And then there were limitations based on how the original studies actually reported their data. For instance, the authors of the meta-analysis couldn't always separate out different types of SSBs, like was it soda or sweetened tea or something else. They also couldn't always do subgroup analyses, like looking separately at men and women for every outcome, simply because the original papers hadn't reported the data that way.
I see. And what about where the studies were done?
That's another big one, a geographic limitation. The overwhelming majority of the studies included came from Europe and North America. But dietary patterns, lifestyles, genetic backgrounds, they could be really different in other parts of the world, like Asia, Africa, South America. So we have to be cautious about generalizing these findings globally, as those populations weren't well represented here.
Okay, that's important context, geographic bias.
And then, crucially, the authors did their own checks for something called publication bias. This is the tendency for studies that find a positive, statistically significant result, like sugary drinks linked to cancer,
Yeah.
to be more likely to get published than studies that find no link or an inconclusive result. And they did find evidence suggesting publication bias might be affecting the overall cancer risk findings for both SSBs and for fruit juice in those cohort studies.
Whoa, hang on. So the very positive links they reported for overall cancer risk might be inflated because studies finding those kinds of links were just more likely to see the light of day and get published in the first place.
That's exactly what the analysis suggested might be happening. And this is a really critical piece that leads straight to their overall conclusion. Despite reporting these statistical associations suggesting a link between sugary drinks and overall cancer risk and mortality, and for some specific cancers, the authors themselves concluded that after they tried to account for this potential bias, the overall quality of the evidence from these observational studies was, and I'm quoting here, poor to identify SSB fruit juice as a risk factor for cancer incidence.
Poor to identify as a risk factor. Wow. That's a really strong cautionary statement coming directly from the authors who did the analysis. It basically means they found the statistical signal, they saw the numbers, but they judged the underlying evidence base to be too weak, too potentially biased, to definitively point the finger and say sugary drinks are a proven cause of cancer based on this particular collection of research.
Precisely. It really highlights the tentative nature of these findings. The results suggest a relationship might be there. They certainly point towards areas needing more investigation, like breast, liver, colorectal, prostate cancer risk, and breast cancer mortality, where the signal seems strongest. They definitely support the hypothesis that sugary drinks could increase risk, perhaps through those metabolic pathways we discussed.
But it's not definitive proof.
No. The authors are very clear. Because it's all based on observational data, with all its inherent challenges, confounding, bias, potential publication bias, this meta-analysis cannot definitively conclude that sugary drinks cause cancer. It's an association, a suggestion, a correlation found in the existing data. It's not proof of causation based on this review.
Which naturally leads to the call for more research, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. That's the logical next step. This kind of meta-analysis is fantastic for summarizing where we are, but its limitations really shine a spotlight on what needs to happen next. The authors explicitly call for more large-scale, really well-designed prospective studies. Future studies need to be super rigorous about minimizing bias. They need consistent ways of measuring what people eat and drink, tracking health outcomes accurately over long periods, and doing an even better job of measuring and controlling for all those potential confounding factors, the diet, the lifestyle, the genetics, everything that could obscure the true picture. Only with that kind of higher quality, more precise research can we hope to either confirm these suggested links with more confidence, or maybe find out that they were largely just artifacts of the limitations in the studies we have so far.
This deep dive really has hammered home the nuance needed when we look at nutrition research, hasn't it? We see a signal, this potential link suggested by pooling lots of observational studies, but then we see the weaknesses, the limitations in that very data, which mean, as the authors themselves stress, we can't jump to a firm causal conclusion. So here's something to think about. Given this potential link suggested by the meta-analysis, even with all its significant limitations, how do you navigate making personal health choices based on science that's still evolving? And what does this constant call for more precise studies really tell us about the careful, step-by-step, often slow journey of scientific discovery when it comes to complex links between our diet and long-term health? Something to ponder, perhaps, next time you're considering what's in your glass.